it's John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to part 4 of our 4-part Commander 2017 deck list series. This is the one where we look at Arcane Wizardry. So we've already looked at the cats, we've looked at the dragons, we've looked at the vampires. Today we're looking at the wizards. Now, much like the other videos, we'll do the same thing here. I'm going to take a deep dive into those first 17 cards, which are the brand new cards that have never been printed before. Some of them are crossing over from other decks, but they are all new to this product. And then we'll look at the reprints, and those reprints we'll do some just quick analysis of, and then finally I'll give you my final thoughts on the deck. Quickly before we get started though, if you check out the description below, you'll find a couple ways to support us, one of which is the Amazon affiliate links. If you make any purchases there, a small percentage will come back to help us out. Also, you'll find our Patreon page below as well. With that being said, let's get into the cards for today. We're going to start off with those foil commanders. So each deck comes with 3 foil commanders. They all meet the color identity requirements of the deck. And the first one, the featured one, is Inala Archmage Ritualist. This one's actually pretty interesting. Not super expensive to cast. Like the other featured commanders, it has Eminence. And this time what Eminence is going to do for you is whenever another non-token wizard enters the battlefield under your control, if this is either in the command zone or on the battlefield, you may pay 1. If you do create a token that's a copy of that wizard, the token gains haste, exile at the beginning of the next end step. Also, what's cool about this card is you can use those tokens even in conjunction with some of your other wizards to use that secondary ability, which could have some benefit for you as well. Now, this is a little more complex than maybe some of the other commanders we've seen earlier. Like the cat commander, for example, is really about just getting in there and fighting, and really so is the vampire featured commander Markov. And to some degree, you can say the same thing even about the Ur-Dragon. They're all about getting in there, fighting, and just pushing. Now, this particular card is a little more finessed. The wizards themselves aren't really doing the heavy lifting as much as the fact that they're trying to get across that their abilities, their spells, those are the things that are going to do the damage. So it's a little more cerebral than maybe some of the other decks we looked at earlier in the week. Now, Inala is playing into the fact that you could find some benefits from temporary creatures that are expendable, and also with their haste ability coming into play, you can activate abilities and use some powerful abilities that are attached to some of these cards. So with that being said, let's look at the next option. We have Kess Dissident Mage. Now she's a little bit different. She is focused on purely instants and sorceries out of the graveyard. So a little bit like Snapcaster Mage, but of course not at instant speed or anything like that. But with her, during each of your turns, you may cast an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard. And of course, if the card's cast this way, you then have to exile it. Herself, she's a 3/4 flyer. She costs 1 less than Inala, so she's a tad bit cheaper to get into play. Now, I will say this particular deck is really focused on graveyard mechanics, which might be a little surprising. If you were to think which one of these 4 decks is really going to care about the graveyard, you might say vampires, but it's actually the wizards. The wizards are digging into the graveyard to get their spells back. It also has a quasi-storm feeling too, which is pretty interesting. They're not going all in on that, but they're giving you some elements to tease you a little bit, and maybe if you decide to upgrade this deck into a storm deck, there are some interesting components here that already exist. All right, let's move on to the third one, and that's Marisol the Pretender. Marisol is also interacting with the graveyard. Can interact with your hand, but probably most of the time you're going to be interacting with the graveyard. And the use of cage counters is actually pretty effective here, because every time you cast Marisol and do this ability, if it's your commander, you could cast this numerous times over the course of the game, or maybe some flicker effects, for example, could get you more benefit out of it. But as the game goes on, Marisol gets more and more powerful. And I think that's actually pretty sweet, and again, another way to really shift the focus of the deck if you wanted to. Now, with that being said, I do want to point out too, great flavor win here with Marisol. This is Lord Ith's antagonist in the Dark. If you go back to some of the flavor text from the Dark, you might remember Maze of Ith, maybe one of the more popular cards from that particular set, along with Blood Moon, I guess. And Marisol is all over the place in the Dark, and that was one of my favorite sets thematically. So it's really cool to see a representation of this card now. Also, too, in the lore, Marisol does put Lord Ith in a cage, so that's where you get the cage counters. There's a card, Barol's Cage, that you see in the Dark as well. So really cool callbacks there. All right, let's move on to the new creatures that are included beyond these 3. you'll get Bloodline Necromancer. We talked about this card yesterday because it's also included in the Vampire deck, but what's kind of funny is it's actually probably better in this deck. There's more of a graveyard theme here than there was in Vampires, so it was a good card there. It might even be a better card here. Galecaster Colossus. Now this is an annoying card that can really mess with board states. Tap an untapped wizard you control, return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. And this thing isn't easy to get rid of either. I mean, it's a 5/6, 6 toughness. It's pretty stable. Not to say it can't be destroyed or exiled, obviously, but it's not going to go down to just a lightning bolt or something like that. So this works pretty good with a Nala as well, because some of those temporary wizards will find more utility with a card like this on the battlefield. Izzet Chemistry. This is the slowest haste card I've ever seen. And the reason I say that is, yes, it has haste, but to get it to really do its thing, it has to stick around for a couple turns and exile instant and sorceries out of your graveyard, and it has to live. And it only has 3 toughness. It's a little squishy. Lightning Bolt does take it out. But if it can survive, you can get a big play with this card. So I don't know. Like, it would be fun to try to make it work, but I feel like this card will have a target on its back. Magus of the Mind. Everybody remember Mind's Desire? Yep, it's back in creature form, and that is a classic Storm card. This thing does the same thing, but the drawback being here, it's going to take you a little more time to do it. You do have to untap with this thing, then it will tap, pay a blue, and sacrifice, then you get the Mind's Desire. That's a little awkward. You're forecasting your move, and your opponents have time to react to it. So, it's okay. Obviously, a Mind's Desire would just be better, but I like the Magus cards. I like when they make these, so it's always cool to see a new one every year in these products. So I'm glad they did it, but it's not super exciting. It reminds me a little bit of the Yawgmoth's Will version they did a while back, which kind of had the same problem. It was just a little too slow. Portal Mage. This is weird. It's kind of a meddling little card, and your opponent's going to declare attackers. If you flash this into play at that time, you get to redirect one of those attackers, basically. So maybe it was going to attack you, you can switch it to another opponent, you can switch it to a Planeswalker even. So I find that pretty intriguing, actually. It's cool. I'm glad they went to play in this territory because this is very unique on its own. I don't know if it's anything super exciting, but it's cool anyway. Taigam Sidisi's Hand. Now here's another card that's going to play well with the graveyard by helping you populate the graveyard. And I also like the fact that every time you were to draw a card, you're basically instead looking at your top 3 cards and taking the one you want. So you get card selection, then those other 2 cards go to the graveyard, which definitely matters in this deck. That secondary ability is nice too, because for some reason, if you don't have anything to do with these cards in the graveyard, you can use this quasi-delve ability to take out a creature. It's kind of cool, but you do have to keep in mind that if you start cannibalizing your graveyard too frequent or maybe too early, that it could take you off some future lines. So that's a little awkward, almost like a non-bow with what this deck's trying to do, but if you need it in a pinch, at least it's there for you. Vindictive Lich. This is a funny little squishy card. You kind of want it to die sometimes, and sometimes opponents might not want it to die, so you could sneak across some damage. But it's interesting. When this does die, choose one or more. Each mode must target a different player. That could include yourself, so like discarding 2 cards might even be relevant in this deck, for example. But yeah, we'll definitely have a big impact as long as there's enough players on the board to be hit by these 3 effects. Alright, let's look at a new sorcery. This is Kindred Dominance, and this is a board sweep for this deck. You're going to notice this deck has a lot of board sweeps because it's a little different than the other decks, and they're trying to make it competitive with them, I think, out of the box. Board sweeps hurt tribal decks pretty bad. This is a tribal deck that's doing something unique. It's not all about putting the pressure on your opponent offensively like some of the others we saw this week are. This is more about being a little more cerebral, and having sweep effects slows down those other decks nicely while you get your game plan going in this deck. So you're going to find a lot of those. This is a real fine sweep, great for tribal. New enchantments, let's take a look at these. You're going to get some more curses. Now we've talked about them in length in the other video, so I don't want to spend too much time on these. You'll get Curse of Disturbance, which gives you the 2/2 black zombie. You get the one that gives you the gold token, which can be converted to mana of any color, Curse of Opulence. Curse of Verbosity, which is the one that is going to let you draw cards. Now I said this in the other videos, a lot of great gameplay comes from this cycle, I think. Really well designed. This is a curse cycle that interacts in a fantastic way in a multiplayer game. It lets you make some tough decisions, makes your opponents make tough decisions about their attacks. You can put this on any opponent, you can put this on yourself, then your opponents have to decide how they interact with the card. Fantastic cycle. Shifting Shadow. This one's interesting to me. I even think this has some potential maybe in Legacy or even Vintage. It is a really unique card. Now, in this deck, it works just great. It does what this deck wants it to do. You put this on a creature, you give it haste, you get to use their ability or attack in, whatever you need to do, and then at the beginning of your next upkeep, you destroy that creature, and you flip cards on the top of your library to hit your next creature, and you go ahead and put it on it. And that's actually pretty intriguing that you're able to work your way through the deck, basically. Now, the cards you flip that are revealed, they do go to the bottom of your library in random order. They don't go to the graveyard, but still the creature that was on it does go to the graveyard. That could matter at times in this particular deck. Now, the reason I say this is interesting outside of Commander is because there are some cool interactions. Like, imagine, for example, you have a token strategy. You could even do this in Commander. You have a token strategy, so you don't have a lot of creatures in your deck, but the creatures you have maybe are really powerful ones. So you put this on a token, and then when the token does eventually die at the beginning of your next upkeep, then you just go ahead and dig through your deck for the next creature. Oh, it happens to be some huge crazy thing. And by the way, if it's pro-red, then this can't even stay on it, so it will fall off due to the state-based effect, and you don't even have to sacrifice it next turn. In Legacy, you could even use this with like Emrakul. Now, Emrakul has protection from spells, but it's only a spell if it's being cast. So if this is being attached to it, it's not attaching as a spell, and it actually does work. So if you have 4 of those in your deck, you could actually attack it with an Emrakul for 4 turns in a row, potentially. Now, is that better than like Through the Breach decks as they stand now, or some of the other like Grizzlebrand variants and stuff? Maybe not. So, I don't know. I'd have to try it out and just see how it plays, I guess. But it seems sweet. Like, there's a lot of things you could do with this card. I feel like someone might find an opportunity to use it in a format aside from Commander. Alright, let's look at a new artifact. This is Mirror of Forebears. We've talked about this one earlier in the week, so I won't spend too much time on it. I will say it's cool for tribal. Maybe it's not as exciting since we saw Mirage Mirror recently. Mirage Mirror is slightly more expensive, though, so yeah, it's fine. And the new land, which is in all 4 decks. We've been talking about it all week. Path of Ancestry. It's basically a command tower that comes into play tapped, but whenever you play your chosen tribe, you get to scry 1 if you play it with mana from this particular card. So that includes your commander, as long as your commander is not a Planeswalker commander from 2014. But other than that, as long as the card you play shares the tribe with your commander, you get that ability. Alright, let's move into reprints, beginning with the creatures. And there's some interesting cards here as we go through. We'll start off with Apprentice Necromancer. When I first saw this preview, I said this was a weird card to include in a wizard deck, but now that I've seen the wizard deck, it kind of makes sense. So not only are you going to sacrifice this to get the ability, but you're able to bring another creature back from the graveyard to the battlefield for 1 turn, then it goes back to the graveyard. So it does make sense for what this deck's trying to do. Arcanus the Omnipotent. Really cool inclusion here. I actually mentioned this card during the previews. I thought it would be a cool one to put in here, and it's here. It made it. So it's easy to return to your hand for 4 mana. Works really good with Anala. You can have some big plays with this card. Archaeomancer. Another card that is going to look into the graveyard, and there's going to be many of them. So this one, of course, pulling an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to hand. Azami, Lady of Scrolls. It's real fragile, but if you can keep this thing alive, tap an untapped wizard to draw a card, yeah, you'll be having a good day. Also, too, this is a nice ability to attach to Marisol later in the game as well, and that card will be a little more stable. Body Double, another graveyard interaction card. This is a clone for anything that's in a graveyard. It doesn't have to be your graveyard, so that opens up a lot of possibilities, but it does target something in a graveyard. Corpse Augur. This is another card that's checking graveyards for card draw and this time loss of life. So it doesn't have to be your graveyard again. If an opponent has a better graveyard size-wise, then you can target that. But again, a nice way to draw some cards for sure. And it has a decent body attached to it, 4/2. Ethereum Horn Sorcerer. Really cool Cascade card if you ever played with this one in the past. It costs 6, it's a 3/6, then you get to Cascade. But for 3, you can return it to its owner's hand. And then when you play it again, you get to Cascade again. So there's definitely some benefit here at times. And again, plays well with Anala for sure. Harbinger of the Tides. A decent card in this particular deck because it interacts well with cards like Anala, for example. But yeah, it's interesting because you don't see a lot of tempo plays necessarily here, but it's a fine card. It helps protect you even at instant speed for the extra 2. Heavengull Lich. Another card that has a interesting ability that, again, could attach to Marisol. You do have to think about these for a lot of these creature and artifact abilities. But on its own, it's still a good card, allowing you to take one card from a graveyard and cast it this turn. It doesn't even have to be your graveyard. And this card even gets the activated abilities of that creature till end of turn. Izzet Chronarch. This is another card that's going to allow you to pull an instant or sorcery from the graveyard to your hand. So again, makes sense with what this deck's trying to do. Magus of the Abyss. Now, another card that's trying to keep maybe some of these other decks in check by making them sacrifice non-artifact creatures. So it makes sense in this deck. It's a real aggressive play, and this is one of the Maguses that is not necessarily a whole lot weaker than the original version. Now, it is a little squishy at 3 toughness, but again, it could hit the board state if your opponents don't have anything to deal with it right away. Marchese of the Black Rose, fantastic reprint from Conspiracy. Now, this was actually a $6-7 card, so real nice inclusion here just generally. Again, it's doing something a little different than the rest of the deck is in some ways, but yes, it is still exploiting the fact that you are playing loose, letting things go to the graveyard. In this case, there are going to be occasions where those things could just come back to the battlefield from the graveyard with Marchese's influence. And I should mention, too, she can be your commander. She does meet the color requirements if you wanted to go down that route. Merchant of Secrets, nice little utility card, works okay with Inala. Mercurial Chemister. This has some nice versatility to it. You can either draw cards or discard a card to do actual damage to target creatures. Sometimes it'll be important based off the discarded cards converted mana cost. And again, you're populating your graveyard for some potential plays in the future. Nin the Pain Artist. A lot of times you'll just simply want to use this on yourself because it deals X damage to target creature. That creature's controller draws X cards. So maybe you damage one of your own creatures that's either expendable or else has enough toughness to deal with it, and you draw the cards. I mean, you can use this to deal with a creature that you need to deal with in a pinch, but you don't necessarily want your opponent drawing a lot of cards off this. Nivix Guildmage. Another card with some nice versatility. It's a little fragile as a 2-2, but you can either loot, which again populates your graveyard, or you can use that second ability to fork something. And that kind of falls into Kess's wheelhouse with a lot of instants and sorceries being cast in a particular turn. Niv Mizzet the Firemind. I always like to see Niv get a reprint. We saw the newer version of Niv in a deck earlier this week. Now, of course, we're seeing the original version. Fantastic card that's going to allow you for some card draw and even some damage to get across. Puppeteer Click. Interesting card to include here. This is going to pull something out of an opponent's graveyard, so it actually doesn't interact with your graveyard. And it lets you take that thing for one time, attack in with it, and then it's going to go away. But it has Persist, so you get to do it again, presumptively. That's the idea here. So it is Commander. There's going to be a lot of good targets to choose from, so maybe this is one of the ways you can get some more damage across. Seagate Oracle. I always like this card. Just a nice way to speed up your deck a little bit, dig a little deeper. Serendib Sorcerer. I always like this card because it was the Planar Chaos take on Sorcerer's Queen from Arabian Nights. I used to play that card a lot back in the day. And even though this is super fragile, it's probably not going to live real long, it does create a situation where opponents are probably not going to attack you because of the bad combat math that could come from this card. Shadow Mage Infiltrator. It's Johnny Magic. I think it's him anyway under those robes. I don't know. Of course, this was John Finkel's invitational card. Classic card. Nice inclusion. Vila the Nightclad. This is actually a great inclusion in this deck. First off, Intimidate's always good, just generally in Commander, but this also gives other creatures you control Intimidate. But what's really interesting is whenever this or another creature you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses a life. And again, you have to think about those Inala tokens that will be coming and going and other things that might be expendable in this deck that could actually be pretty sweet. Alright, let's look at sorceries. You get a Clone Legion. So Clone Legion is great when you have good enters the battlefield effects. There's definitely some good ones in this deck that you could exploit. It's not a cheap card, but very easily castable in the mid-game in most Commander games for you. So yeah, this can actually be pretty awesome. Decree of Pain, another one of the board sweeps you'll find here, and this is another good one. You can cycle this away and hit everything for -2/-2, and that's fine, but what you really want to do is cast it for the full price, destroy all creatures. They can't be regenerated, and draw a card for each creature destroyed this way. Huge implication on the board and huge implication for your hand. Necromantic Selection. This was another interesting board sweep. You destroy all creatures, and then out of those creatures, you basically get to take the best one. And that's actually pretty sweet. Spell Twine. So for 6 mana, you cast the best thing in your graveyard, instant or sorcery-wise, and the best thing in one of the opponent's graveyards, instant or sorcery-wise. For 6 mana, I feel like you can definitely find some economy here. Instance. We're going to look at Cauldron Dance. Now, this one's interesting because typically when you go too far back in the history of Magic and reprint something, you can't use the original art, or Wizards can't use the original art because they don't necessarily own the rights to all that old art. Now, they do business differently in the modern era, of course, where they do own rights to the images, but typically, older cards, when they get reprinted, have to get new art. And this one, though, was an exception, obviously. This one they must have owned the rights to and brought it back. The card itself is perfect for this deck. It scratches all the itches you have for this deck. It has cards coming into play, exploiting enters battlefield effects potentially. It is putting something at least back into the graveyard, even though it is taking something out of the graveyard. And at the same time, it's maybe bringing back something that's important to you. So there's a lot happening here. And again, if you are adding wizards to the battlefield, it does open the possibility to exploit Nala's ability too. So this one's pretty cool, like a really nice inclusion for this particular deck. Chaos Warp, the card that probably should be blue, but here it is, it's red, and it's a good card. I mean, it's a little high variance, sure, sometimes your opponent does hit something you don't want them to hit, but most of the time you're safe, and it's at instant speed, so you just deal with the threat if you need to. Comet Storm, the infamous Comet Storm that we saw in Modern Masters 2015 as a mythic, and that did not make a lot of people happy. It was kind of the Zonk prize if you opened a mythic, and it was the $1 Comet Storm, but aside from that, it's actually a good card, and you'll be happy to play it in this deck for sure. Croesus Charm, I like whenever they can add some of the charms. The versatility is awesome, and this one's an older one, so it's nice to see it get a reprint. Go for the Throat, another card that really is nice to see reprinted. This was getting up there in price, so it's always good to be able to create a product like this that brings more of these into the market. Into the Royal. Not a huge play, but you want to kind of play this with a kicker, draw a card off it. Nice little tempo play. Memory Plunder. Nice to see Shadowmoor cards reprinted, especially the rares whenever you can, because they did have a much lower print run. So Memory Plunder is one of those. This one simply allows you to cast an instant or sorcery from an opponent's graveyard. So again, for 4 mana, you can probably find some economy there in a game of Commander. Opportunity, find draw spell at instant speed. There's probably better ones out there, but this one's okay. Polymorphous Jest. Okay, this is a 3 casting cost instant that can really mess up combat for an opponent. And it doesn't necessarily mean they have to be attacking you. It could just be an exchange that's going on the field. You could just interrupt it with this and really knock out someone's army pretty much. So it's a real cool ace up the sleeve card. Rakdos Charm, another charm. Always nice to see these. Reality Shift, another way to defend yourself. Real cheap way to exile a creature at instant speed. Selmagar's Command. Commands are also always welcome. I love the versatility they bring. Terminate, Pinpoint Removal. Alright, let's look at some artifacts. You're going to find a lot of color fixing here, as you'd imagine, with Commander's Spear, for example. Another one with Darksteel Ingot. Felwar Stone, another one, this one from the Dark. Navineral's Disc. Interesting ability here. Navineral's Disc traditionally a little bit slow because it does come into play tapped. It does forecast what you're doing to your opponents. But remember, Maricel works with artifacts and creatures. This could be an interesting ability to eventually staple onto that card. Sol Ring, best mana rock ever. Glad to see these printed in all these products. Unstable Obelisk. Here's another card that would have a nice ability attachment, maybe for Maricel, but just in general, a good mana rock that eventually, when you maybe don't need it anymore, does something else. Destroy target permanent can actually be very powerful. Worn Power Stone, another very good mana rock. Alright, let's look at the lands. Again, you're going to find mostly color fixing here. Command Tower, we get one of these in every deck. It's just a staple now of the format. Crumbling Necropolis, one of the tri-lands. Dimir Aqueduct, you get a bounce land. Dismal Backwater. Evolving Wilds. Exotic Orchard. Grixis Panorama. Is it Boilerworks? Dwar Isle of Refuge. Mystifying Maze, kind of the poor man's Maze of Ith. It would have been kind of cool to see like a Maze of Ith show up in here, even though probably value-wise that might have been a little too high for this product, but it would have fit well with Marisol. Rakdos Canarium, Swiftwater Cliffs, Temple of the False God, Terramorphic Expanse, Vivid Crag, Vivid Creek, Vivid Marsh, and then you're into your basics. So I mentioned this in the previous videos, but they did use the art from the last year's product. So you get the Rebecca Guay cycle, the Mark Poole cycle, and the Kev Walker cycle, and they look amazing. You get 10 islands, 4 mountains, and 6 swamps. All right, so what are my final thoughts on this one? This deck is a little different than the others we looked at. This one's a little more cerebral, where you feel like the other decks were all about pressing damage across. I mean, look at those main commanders when you had Arabo, for example, which is all about just making things big and trampling. In Vampires, you had Markov, which was about boosting your Anthem effect and just getting in there for some damage. Then you had the Ur-Dragon, which was all about attacking in with big old dragons, right? So this deck's not doing that. This deck is trying to be a little cerebral, a little more methodical. It's trying to exploit instants and sorceries. It's exploiting the graveyard, and it's also exploiting a lot of abilities, both abilities that are triggered abilities as well as abilities that are activated. So maybe a deck that's harder to pilot for a new player. If I'm brand new to the game, this might not be my first choice among the 4. I might look for something that's a little more straightforward. But if you're a more experienced player, there's a lot of fun to be had here. And again, there's some upgrade options to press the instants and sorceries, maybe a little bit harder than they're pressed here. But there's a lot of different directions you could go with a game plan here, and I do find that pretty awesome. I like the deck a lot. I like what they're trying to do here. It feels a little bit more like some of the decks we saw last year, where last year's decks all had some interesting concepts and different interactions that were very unique to them. This year, if I had one complaint about these 4, which I don't really have many complaints because I do think the products are pretty awesome, I would say that some of the decks just felt too similar. And granted, they're all tribal decks, so really that's going to happen if that's going to be your theme. But this one does break the mold a little bit. And if you're looking for something unique that's not just all about attacking in and maybe gaining some life and getting some damage and attritioning out the board, this is the deck for you. It's going to do something very different. Now, at the end of the day, play the tribe you love, right? If you love wizards, this will be the deck for you. But if you love dragons, play the dragon deck, right? If you like cats or vampires, play those decks. That's ultimately what Commander is all about, is playing the cards that are fun for you, that you enjoy, not necessarily looking for the thing that's the highest power level or anything like that. And with that being said, those are my thoughts on all 4 of these decks now. So I hope you found these videos useful to you. Really, they're a guide to let you see what's in the deck, just giving you some of my quick thoughts on the cards, but really help you decide on which purchase you wanted to make. If you're only going to buy 1, maybe 2 of these decks, which ones are you going to pick up? Hopefully this video series helps you get there. And if that's the case, then I feel like I did some good. So until next time, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.